7-year-old Emma Catherine Morrison sat quietly in seat 2A of the Boeing 737, her small legs barely reaching the edge of the first-class leather seat, carefully coloring in a book about military aircraft while her parents dozed beside her. Despite her young age, Emma possessed an unusual combination of intelligence, composure, and knowledge that consistently surprised adults who underestimated her capabilities based solely on her size and pigtails. Emma came from a family where military service wasn't just a career. It was a legacy passed down through 4 generations. Her great-grandfather had flown P-51 Mustangs over Europe during World War II. Her grandfather had piloted helicopters in Vietnam, and her father, Colonel James Morrison, was currently serving as a senior operations officer at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Her mother, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, was a former Air Force intelligence officer who now worked as a defense contractor specializing in tactical communication systems. Growing up in this environment meant that Emma had been exposed to military protocol, aviation terminology, and strategic thinking from the moment she could walk and talk. While other children her age were learning basic colors and numbers, Emma was absorbing lessons about chain of command, emergency procedures, and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. Her bedtime stories often involved tales of heroic pilots, and her toys included detailed scale models of fighter aircraft that she could identify by sight and recite performance specifications from memory. The Morrison family was traveling from Norfolk Naval Air Station to San Diego for what was supposed to be a relaxing vacation, combining visits to extended family with tours of military installations that held special significance in their family history. Colonel Morrison had recently completed a demanding 6-month deployment, and the entire family was looking forward to some quality time together away from the pressures of military life. Emma had been particularly excited about the trip because it would include a visit to the USS Midway Museum, where she planned to see the aircraft that her great-grandfather had told her stories about, and a tour of Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, where some of her father's former colleagues were now stationed. She had prepared for the trip by reading everything she could find about naval aviation history, and had even memorized the call signs and aircraft assignments of several famous military pilots. As Flight 1847 climbed to cruising altitude over the Virginia countryside, Emma noticed details that most adult passengers miss entirely. She observed that the flight crew consisted of a captain and first officer who both appeared to be former military personnel based on their bearing, communication style, and the way they conducted their pre-flight procedures. She noted that several passengers in the cabin were also likely military members or veterans, recognizable by subtle indicators like their posture, haircuts, and the way they instinctively organized their carry-on items. What Emma couldn't have known was that this particular flight was carrying an unusually high concentration of military personnel, including active duty service members returning from leave, retired veterans traveling to reunions, and defense contractors heading to meetings at various West Coast installations. The passenger manifest read like a who's who of American military aviation, though most of these individuals were traveling in civilian clothes and keeping their professional identities private. Emma's parents had trained her to be observant and aware of her surroundings, skills that were second nature in military families but unusual for a 7-year-old civilian. She automatically noted emergency exits, identified potential threats or unusual behavior, and maintained what her father called situational awareness even during routine activities like air travel. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Emma continued her coloring while listening to conversations around her. Her young ears picked up fragments of discussions about flight operations, military exercises, and technical specifications that most children her age would have ignored completely. But Emma found these conversations fascinating, and she unconsciously filed away information that would prove crucial in the hours ahead. The flight attendants, noticing Emma's unusual maturity and her obvious familiarity with aviation topics, struck up conversations with her about her coloring book and her family's military background. Emma responded with a kind of articulate, respectful communication that impressed adults and reflected her upbringing in a household where precision of language and clarity of thought were valued above all else. "Are you going to be a pilot like your daddy when you grow up?" asked a senior flight attendant, a woman named Jennifer who had been working commercial aviation for over 15 years. "I'm going to be a general," Emma replied matter-of-factly, not looking up from her coloring. "Daddy says that generals have to understand all the different jobs before they can lead effectively, so I'm learning about pilots and maintenance crews and air traffic controllers and logistics officers. When I'm old enough, I'll serve as a pilot first, then work my way up through different commands until I have enough experience to make strategic decisions. Jennifer smiled at what she assumed was typical childhood ambition, but Emma's parents exchanged a look that suggested their daughter's career planning was considerably more serious and detailed than most adults realized. Emma had been discussing military strategy and leadership principles since she was 5 years old, and her understanding of complex organizational structures often surprised professional military officers who met her at social gatherings. As the morning sun streamed through the aircraft windows and Flight 1847 continued its westward journey across the American heartland, none of the passengers could have anticipated that Emma's unusual knowledge and remarkable composure were about to be tested in ways that would challenge even experienced military professionals. 2 hours into Flight 1847, as the Boeing 737 crossed into Missouri airspace at 37,000 feet, Captain Mitchell Rodriguez received a priority communication from air traffic control that immediately changed the atmosphere in the cockpit from routine to urgent. The message was brief but alarming. A widespread communications failure had affected multiple air traffic control centers across the central United States, creating confusion and potential safety hazards for dozens of aircraft flying through the affected regions. The technical details were complex, but the practical implications were straightforward and dangerous. Primary radar systems were functioning normally, allowing controllers to track aircraft positions, but voice communications, data links, and coordination between different air traffic control centers had been severely compromised. Aircraft could see and be seen, but the normal flow of information that keeps commercial aviation safe and efficient had been disrupted across multiple states. Captain Rodriguez, a former Navy pilot with over 20 years of commercial flying experience, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. Without reliable communication between aircraft and air traffic control, the carefully orchestrated dance of modern aviation became chaotic and potentially deadly. Planes could collide, runways could become congested, and emergency services might not receive critical information about aircraft in distress. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez. His voice came over the intercom with a calm professionalism that passengers expect during unusual situations. We've been advised of some temporary communication difficulties affecting air traffic control facilities along our route. As a precautionary measure, we're going to implement some additional safety procedures and may experience slight delays in our arrival time. There's no immediate danger to our aircraft, but we want to ensure everyone's safety by following enhanced protocols. What Captain Rodriguez didn't announce was that the communication failures appeared to be more than just technical malfunctions. Intelligence reports suggested possible cyber attacks on critical aviation infrastructure, and military commands across the country were quietly moving to heightened alert status. Several commercial flights had already been diverted to military airfields as a precautionary measure, and air defense systems were being activated to monitor for potential threats. Emma Morrison, despite her young age, immediately recognized that the captain's announcement contained more information than most passengers understood. Her military upbringing had taught her to listen for subtext in official communications, and phrases like enhanced protocols and precautionary measures suggested a situation considerably more serious than routine technical difficulties. She quietly observed the reactions of other passengers, noting that several individuals who appeared to be military personnel were discreetly checking their mobile devices and exhibiting subtle signs of increased alertness. Her father, Colonel Morrison, had straightened in his seat and was scanning the cabin with the focused attention of someone assessing a potential tactical situation. "Daddy," Emma whispered, leaning close to her father's ear. The captain said communication difficulties, but his tone pattern and stress indicators suggest external threat assessment rather than equipment failure. "Are we dealing with a coordinated attack on aviation infrastructure?" Colonel Morrison looked at his 7-year-old daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Emma's analytical abilities often surprised him, but her question demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that was remarkable even by the standards of their military family. More troubling was the fact that her assessment appeared to be accurate. "We don't know yet, sweetheart," he replied quietly. "But you're right to be observant. Remember what we've taught you about staying calm and being ready to help if adults need your assistance." What none of the passengers knew was that the situation was deteriorating rapidly beyond their aircraft. Military intelligence agencies had confirmed that the communication failures were the result of sophisticated cyber attacks targeting critical aviation infrastructure. The attacks appeared to be coordinated and were affecting not just civilian air traffic control systems, but also military command and control networks across multiple time zones. Fighter aircraft from several Air Force bases were already scrambling to provide escort and reconnaissance of commercial flights in affected airspace, and emergency protocols were being implemented to handle what could potentially become the most serious threat to American aviation since September 11, 2001. The attacks weren't just disrupting communications. They were testing the resilience of systems designed to protect American airspace from hostile forces. Captain Rodriguez received another priority communication, this one directing him to divert to Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, where military air traffic controllers with secure communication systems could provide guidance until the civilian infrastructure could be restored, alternative procedures implemented. The diversion would add several hours to their journey, but it would ensure the safety of passengers and provide military authorities with better control over aircraft movements in the affected region. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again," Rodriguez announced. "We've been directed to make an unscheduled stop at Scott Air Force Base in Illinois, where we'll receive updated information about our continued journey to San Diego. This is purely a precautionary measure, and we expect to be on the ground for approximately 2 hours while authorities assess the situation." As Flight 1847 began its descent toward the military airfield, Emma continued her quiet observations, noting increased radio chatter in the cockpit and the appearance of military escort aircraft outside the passenger windows. What she was witnessing was the implementation of emergency protocols that most civilians would never see, and her unique background allowed her to understand the gravity of the situation in ways that other passengers could not. The Boeing 737 landed at Scott Air Force Base under military air traffic control, taxiing to a remote area of the airfield where security personnel and intelligence officers were waiting to brief passengers and assess the continuing threat to aviation infrastructure. Emma was about to find herself in an environment where her unusual knowledge and remarkable composure would be not just appreciated, but desperately needed. As the aircraft came to a stop and passengers began gathering their carry-on items, Emma noticed something that made her small hand reach for her father's sleeve with urgent but controlled pressure, a gesture that in their family meant she had observed something critically important that required immediate adult attention. "Daddy," she whispered, "look at the personnel positioning around our aircraft. That's not standard arrival protocol for a precautionary landing. That's threat assessment formation for potential hostile action aboard civilian aircraft." Within 30 minutes of landing at Scott Air Force Base, all 147 passengers from Flight 1847 found themselves in an unprecedented situation, being briefed by active duty Air Force personnel about a national security crisis that was still unfolding in real time. The base's main briefing auditorium, normally used for classified military presentations, had been hastily converted into a civilian information center where passengers could receive updates about the situation and understand why their flight had been diverted. Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins, the base commander, took the podium with a kind of authoritative presence that immediately commanded attention from the diverse group of travelers. Her briefing was clear, professional, and more detailed than most civilian passengers had ever received about aviation security matters. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm General Hawkins, and I want to explain why you're here and what we're doing to ensure your safety," she began. "The United States is currently experiencing coordinated cyber attacks against critical aviation infrastructure. These attacks have disrupted communication systems, data links, and coordination networks that are essential for safe civilian air travel." The general continued with technical details about the scope of the attacks, the response measures being implemented, and the timeline for restoring normal operations. What she didn't immediately mention was that intelligence agencies believed the attacks were a precursor to more serious hostile actions, and that military commands across the country were preparing for potential escalation. Emma Morrison sat between her parents in the third row of the auditorium, listening intently to every word while simultaneously observing the body language and communication patterns of the military personnel conducting the briefing. Her young mind was processing information on multiple levels, analyzing not just what was being said, but what was being left unsaid and what the implications might be for both immediate safety and longer-term strategic concerns. During the question and answer period that followed the general presentation, several passengers asked about timeline for departure, alternative transportation arrangements, and communication with family members. Emma listened to these questions and the responses with growing concern, recognizing that the answers were more evasive than they initially appeared. When General Hawkins asked if there were any final questions before passengers were escorted to temporary accommodation facilities, Emma raised her small hand with the confidence of someone who had been participating in military briefings since she was old enough to sit quietly in adult meetings. "General Hawkins," Emma said, standing up with the respectful posture her parents had taught her, "your briefing mentioned cyber attacks on aviation infrastructure, but the response protocols you described suggest preparation for kinetic threats as well. Are we dealing with a multi-domain attack scenario? And if so, what's the anticipated timeline for hostile force deployment?" The auditorium fell completely silent. General Hawkins stared at the 7-year-old girl who had just asked a question that demonstrated understanding of military terminology and strategic concepts that most adult civilians would never encounter. Several military personnel in the room exchanged glances that suggested Emma had asked exactly the question they had been hoping no one would think to ask. "Young lady," General Hawkins said carefully, "that's a very sophisticated question. May I ask what your background is?" Emma responded with a kind of precise military introduction she had been taught since childhood. Emma Catherine Morrison, daughter of Colonel James Morrison, Nellis Air Force Base Operations Officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Morrison, retired Air Force Intelligence. "I've been attending family military briefings since I was 5 years old, and I understand operational security protocols." Colonel Morrison stood up beside his daughter, recognizing that the situation had suddenly become more complex. "General, my daughter has been raised in a military environment and has unusual familiarity with strategic concepts. Her question reflects genuine analytical ability, not casual curiosity." General Hawkins made a decision that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but seemed appropriate given the extraordinary situation they were all facing. "Colonel Morrison, would you and your family be willing to participate in a classified briefing? Your daughter's question suggests she might be able to contribute to our situational assessment in ways that could be valuable." What followed was unprecedented in the history of American military operations. A 7-year-old civilian was granted temporary security clearance to participate in a classified briefing about an ongoing national security crisis. Emma found herself in a conference room with senior military officers, intelligence analysts, and defense contractors being asked for her observations and insights about the unfolding situation. The classified briefing revealed that the cyber attacks were indeed precursors to a more comprehensive assault on American infrastructure. Hostile forces had been testing response times, communication redundancies, and coordination capabilities across multiple critical systems. The aviation attacks were just the beginning of what appeared to be a sophisticated, multi-phase operation designed to create chaos and confusion while more serious threats were deployed. Emma listened to the intelligence presentations with the focused attention of someone far beyond her chronological age. When asked for her assessment, she provided analysis that impressed experienced intelligence professionals with its clarity and strategic insight. The pattern suggests they are trying to create multiple simultaneous crises that will overwhelm response capabilities, Emma said, using a pointer to indicate locations on a large tactical display. By targeting aviation first, they are forcing military assets to be deployed for defensive purposes rather than maintaining offensive readiness. The cyber attacks are creating communication gaps that will make coordination difficult when the primary assault begins. Major General Harrison, the senior intelligence officer present, looked at Emma with something approaching amazement. "Colonel Morrison, your daughter has just provided an assessment that matches our best intelligence analysis. Where did she learn strategic thinking at this level?" "From us," Colonel Morrison replied with obvious pride. "Emma has been participating in family discussions about military strategy since she could walk. We've never talked down to her or simplified concepts just because of her age. She's been absorbing this information for 7 years." As the classified briefing continued and the scope of the crisis became clearer, it became obvious that Emma's unique combination of knowledge, analytical ability, and fresh perspective might be exactly what the military response team needed. General Hawkins made another unprecedented decision. Emma Morrison, age 7, was officially designated as a temporary consultant to the crisis response team, with the unofficial call sign that would follow her for the rest of her life: Little General. In the secure conference room at Scott Air Force Base, surrounded by veteran military officers with decades of combat and strategic planning experience, 7-year-old Emma Morrison stood before a massive digital display showing real-time intelligence data from across the continental United States. What she was about to demonstrate would challenge every assumption about age, experience, and the sources of military wisdom. The situation had deteriorated significantly in the 2 hours since Flight 1847's emergency landing. The initial cyber attacks on aviation infrastructure had been followed by coordinated strikes against power grids, communication networks, and transportation systems in 12 major metropolitan areas. What had begun as a technical problem affecting air traffic control had evolved into a comprehensive assault on American critical infrastructure. Major General Harrison, the senior intelligence officer coordinating the response, had been struggling to identify the underlying pattern connecting the various attacks. Traditional intelligence analysis suggested multiple possible scenarios, but none fully explained the timing, geographic distribution, and technical sophistication of the coordinated strikes. Military response teams were being deployed reactively, responding to each new crisis as it emerged rather than anticipating the enemy's next moves. Little General. General Hawkins said, using the call sign that had already stuck among the military personnel present, "We've shown you our intelligence assessments and our current understanding of the threat pattern. Based on your analysis, what do you think the enemy is trying to accomplish, and where do you expect them to strike next?" Emma studied the digital display for several minutes, her young eyes moving systematically across the data points while her mind processed information in ways that impressed the experienced analysts watching her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had reached conclusions based on logical analysis rather than guesswork. "They are not trying to destroy infrastructure permanently," Emma began, pointing to specific locations on the map. "Look at the pattern of attacks. They are creating temporary disruptions that require immediate response and resource allocation, but they are not causing permanent damage that would take months to repair. This suggests their real objective is somewhere else entirely." She moved to a different section of the display, highlighting geographic areas that had not yet been affected by the attacks. The disruptions are forcing military assets to be deployed defensively in major population centers, which means reducing defensive coverage in these rural and coastal areas. "I think the infrastructure attacks are diversion designed to create gaps in our defensive perimeter." Major General Harrison leaned forward with intense interest. "What kind of gaps, and for what purpose?" Emma's analysis became more detailed and sophisticated as she warmed to the subject. "If I were planning an infiltration operation, I would want air defense systems focused on protecting cities rather than monitoring remote areas where small aircraft or unmanned systems could penetrate undetected. The aviation communication disruptions aren't just creating chaos. They're making it difficult to coordinate tracking of low-altitude flights that might be carrying personnel or equipment for follow-up operations." The room fell silent as the implications of Emma's assessment became clear. The cyber attacks weren't the primary assault. They were preparation for something more serious, something that required reduced surveillance and defensive coverage in precisely the areas that were being left unprotected by the reactive response to the infrastructure disruptions. Colonel Sarah Morrison, Emma's mother and a former intelligence officer, recognized the strategic insight her daughter was demonstrating. "Emma, if you're correct about this being a diversion, what will be the most likely targets for the real operation?" Emma returned to the display, highlighting several locations with laser-pointer precision. Military installations with strategic weapons systems, research facilities working on advanced defense technologies, and command centers responsible for coordinating national defense responses. The infrastructure attacks are creating windows of opportunity when surveillance assets and rapid response teams are committed elsewhere. General Hawkins immediately activated secure communication links to military commands across the country, relaying Emma's assessment and requesting enhanced surveillance of the installations she had identified as potential targets. Within minutes, reconnaissance aircraft and satellite systems were being repositioned to monitor the areas that a 7-year-old strategic analyst had identified as most vulnerable. The response was immediate and dramatic. Enhanced surveillance detected low-altitude aircraft approaching 3 separate military installations, aircraft that had not been visible on standard radar systems because they were flying routes designed to avoid detection during periods when defensive assets were deployed elsewhere. Emma's analysis had anticipated the enemy's strategy with accuracy that impressed the most experienced intelligent professionals in the room. "Little General," Major General Harrison said with genuine admiration, "your assessment may have just prevented a coordinated attack on some of our most sensitive military facilities. How did you see the pattern that we missed?" Emma's response demonstrated wisdom that transcended her chronological age. You were looking at the attacks as individual problems requiring individual solutions. But I was looking at them as parts of a larger plan, because that's how my parents taught me to think about strategy. Every action has a purpose, and if you can understand the purpose, you can predict the next action. The success of Emma's strategic analysis led to rapid deployment of defensive measures that successfully intercepted hostile forces before they could reach their intended targets. The infrastructure attacks continued for several more hours, but their effectiveness as diversions had been eliminated by Emma's insights into their true purpose. As reports came in confirming the neutralization of multiple hostile infiltration teams, General Hawkins made an official recommendation that would become part of military history. Emma Catherine Morrison, age 7, should be recognized for her contribution to national defense with a commendation normally reserved for senior intelligence officers. But Emma's most significant contribution was yet to come. As the immediate crisis wound down and normal operations began to be restored, she made an observation that would influence American defense strategy for years to come. The people who planned this attack understood our response procedures better than we understood their attack strategy, Emma said quietly. We need to think more like they think, and less like we think they should think. As night fell over Scott Air Force Base, Emma Morrison found herself at the center of the most unusual military coordination effort in modern American history. The secure conference room had been transformed into an impromptu command center with real-time intelligence feeds, tactical displays, and communication links connecting her to senior military commanders across multiple time zones who were seeking her unique perspective on the unfolding crisis. The immediate threats identified by Emma's strategic analysis had been successfully neutralized, but the broader implications of the coordinated infrastructure attacks were still being assessed. Intelligence agencies were working to determine whether the hostile forces had additional operational phases planned, and military commands were trying to balance defensive preparations with a need to restore normal civilian services. What made Emma's continued involvement unprecedented was not just her age, but the fact that her strategic insights were proving more valuable than those of career intelligence officers with decades of experience. Her ability to see patterns that adults miss, combined with her fresh perspective unencumbered by conventional assumptions, was providing exactly the kind of analytical breakthrough that the situation required. Little General, Major General Harrison said, using the call sign that had now been officially entered into the base's communication logs, we've intercepted communication suggesting that the hostile forces may have contingency operations planned that their primary objectives were compromised. Based on your analysis of their strategic approach, what would you expect their next moves to be? Emma studied the latest intelligence reports while simultaneously monitoring multiple communication channels that were providing updates from affected regions across the country. Her young mind was processing information from sources ranging from satellite reconnaissance to social media analytics, looking for patterns that might reveal enemy intentions. They've demonstrated sophisticated understanding of our response protocols and infrastructure vulnerabilities, Emma replied, her voice carrying the analytical tone she had absorbed from years of listening to military briefings. If their primary operation has been compromised, they'll likely shift to psychological and economic warfare designed to create long-term instability rather than immediate tactical advantages. She moved to the main tactical display, highlighting specific geographic and demographic areas. Instead of continuing direct attacks on military targets, I would expect them to focus on civilian infrastructure in ways that create public fear and economic disruption. The goal would be to undermine confidence in government protective capabilities while avoiding direct confrontation with military forces. Colonel Morrison watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern as she provided strategic analysis that was influencing decisions being made at the highest levels of military command. Emma's insights were proving invaluable, but he was also aware that she was being exposed to classified information and strategic concepts that would normally be restricted to adults with extensive security clearances. Emma's prediction proved accurate within hours. Intelligence report began confirming coordinated attacks on civilian targets including shopping centers, transportation hubs, and utility distribution points in multiple states. The attacks were designed to create maximum psychological impact while avoiding direct confrontation with military defensive systems, exactly as Emma had anticipated. More significantly, Emma's understanding of the enemy's strategic approach allowed military response teams to anticipate target selections and deploy protective measures before attacks occurred rather than responding reactively after damage had been done. Her ability to think like the hostile planners was providing defensive advantages that traditional intelligence analysis had failed to achieve. The pattern suggests they are trying to create a perception of widespread vulnerability without actually engaging in prolonged conflict, Emma explained during a secure video conference with Pentagon officials. They want to demonstrate that they can disrupt American society at will, but they don't want to trigger the kind of massive military response that direct attacks on government facilities would provoke. General Hawkins realized that Emma's analytical capabilities represented a strategic asset that could have applications far beyond the current crisis. Her unique combination of fresh perspective, strategic education, and intuitive understanding of hostile planning methods suggested potential for contributions to long-term defense planning and threat assessment. Little General, the base commander said carefully, "Would you be willing to consider ongoing consultation with military strategic planning teams? Your insights could be valuable for anticipating future threats and improving our defensive preparedness." Emma's response demonstrated the maturity and sense of responsibility that had impressed military professionals throughout the crisis. "General Hawkins, I want to help protect our country, but I also want to have a normal childhood and education. If there's a way to contribute without compromising my development as a regular kid, I'd be honored to help." The solution that emerged reflected both Emma's unique value and the military's respect for her parents' concerns about her well-being. She would participate in periodic strategic assessment sessions during school vacations, provide written analysis of hypothetical scenarios for training purposes, and serve as a consultant for developing defensive strategies against unconventional threats. More importantly, Emma's experience during the infrastructure crisis led to the development of new training programs designed to encourage fresh thinking and unconventional analysis among professional intelligence officers. Her success in seeing patterns that experienced adults had missed prompted a comprehensive review of analytical methods and assumptions that had limited the effectiveness of traditional threat assessment procedures. As the immediate crisis finally began to wind down and civilian aviation operations slowly returned to normal, Emma prepared to complete her interrupted journey to San Diego. But she was no longer just a 7-year-old passenger traveling with her military family. She was now officially designated as a strategic consultant to the United States Air Force, with security clearances and responsibilities that would influence her life for years to come. The hostile forces responsible for the infrastructure attacks were eventually identified and neutralized through international law enforcement cooperation, but their sophisticated understanding of American defensive vulnerabilities led to significant changes in national security protocols and strategic planning methods. 6 months after the infrastructure crisis that transformed Flight 1847's routine vacation trip into a defining moment in national security history, Emma Morrison sat in a specially designed conference room at Nellis Air Force Base, participating in her third official strategic planning session with senior military commanders. At 7.5 years old, she had become the youngest person ever to hold an official consulting position with the United States Air Force, and her insight continued to influence defensive strategies at the highest levels of government. The conference room had been modified to accommodate Emma's size and needs while maintaining the security and professional atmosphere required for classified military planning sessions. A custom-designed workstation allowed her to access tactical displays and communication systems, while specialized furniture ensured her comfort during extended analytical sessions that sometimes lasted several hours. Today's session focused on long-term strategic planning for defending against unconventional threats, a field where Emma's unique perspective had proven invaluable over the past several months. Her ability to think beyond traditional assumptions and identify patterns that experienced analysts missed had led to successful anticipation of 3 separate hostile operations and contributed to the development of new defensive protocols that were being implemented across multiple military commands. Little General, Brigadier General Patricia Hawkins said, using the call sign that had now become Emma's official designation in all military communications, "Our intelligence analysts have been studying the methods you use to identify the infrastructure attack pattern. They are trying to develop training programs that will help other analysts apply similar approaches to threat assessment. Can you explain how you see patterns that we miss?" Emma's response demonstrated the remarkable analytical maturity she had developed through her unique experiences while still maintaining the directness and honesty characteristic of her age. I think the problem is that adults sometimes know too much about how things are supposed to work, so they don't notice when someone is doing things differently. I don't have as many assumptions about what's normal, so I can see when patterns don't fit expected behaviors. She moved to the tactical display, highlighting examples from recent intelligence analyses. When you showed me the infrastructure attacks, I wasn't thinking about what terrorists usually do or what military doctrine says they should do. I was just looking at what they actually did and trying to figure out why those specific actions would make sense as part of a bigger plan. Major General Harrison, who had been present during Emma's first strategic analysis 6 months earlier, nodded with understanding. So your advantage comes from not having preconceived notions about how enemies should behave. Partly, Emma replied, but also from thinking about strategy the way my parents taught me. They always said that every military action should have a clear purpose, and if you can understand the purpose, you can predict what someone will do next. Most adults seem to focus on what enemies are doing right now instead of trying to figure out what they are trying to accomplish overall. Emma's insights had led to the development of what military strategists now call fresh eyes analysis, a systematic approach to threat assessment that deliberately incorporated perspectives from individuals without extensive prior experience in traditional intelligence methods. The program had been tested successfully in multiple scenarios and was being adopted by intelligence agencies across the defense establishment. But Emma's contributions extended beyond analytical methods. Her success had prompted a broader examination of how the military could better utilize unconventional resources and perspectives in strategic planning. Programs were being developed to incorporate insight from individuals with unique backgrounds, different cultural perspectives, and non-traditional educational experiences in ways that could enhance overall defensive capabilities. The most significant long-term impact of Emma's involvement was a recognition that effective strategic thinking could emerge from unexpected sources and that age, experience, and formal credentials weren't always the most important qualification for analytical insight. Military academies began incorporating coursework designed to encourage the kind of fresh thinking that Emma had demonstrated, and intelligence training programs started emphasizing pattern recognition over conventional assumption-based analysis. Little General. General Hawkins said as the session concluded, "You've contributed more to American defense strategy in 6 months than most career officers accomplish in entire lifetimes. But I want to make sure that your military consulting doesn't interfere with your education and your development as a normal kid." Emma's response reflected both a sense of responsibility and her understanding of a unique position. General Hawkins, helping protect our country is important, but so is learning math and science and reading books and playing with friends my own age. I think I can do both, as long as everyone remembers that I'm still just a kid who happens to be good at noticing patterns. The balance that Emma and her family maintained between her military consulting role and her normal childhood became a model for how exceptional young talents could be nurtured and utilized without compromising their personal development. She continued to attend regular school, participate in age-appropriate activities, and maintain friendships with children who knew nothing about her classified work with the Air Force. As Emma approached her 8th birthday, military strategists were already discussing her potential contributions to long-term defense planning and the possibility that her analytical methods could influence intelligence operations for decades to come. But they were also committed to ensuring that her unique talents were developed responsibly, with careful attention to her well-being and her rights as a child. The infrastructure crisis that had transformed Flight 1847 from a routine vacation trip into a national security incident had revealed not just vulnerabilities in American defensive systems, but also unexpected sources of strength and insight. Emma Morrison's emergence as Little General demonstrated that effective military leadership and strategic thinking could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the defense of the nation sometimes required the courage to listen to voices that conventional wisdom might dismiss. Years later, when Emma Morrison achieved her childhood goal of becoming a real general officer in the United States Air Force, military historians would trace her exceptional career back to that February morning when a 7-year-old girl raised her hand in a military briefing room and asked a question that changed how America thinks about strategic defense. Her story became a reminder that wisdom doesn't always come with age, that leadership can emerge from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important voices are the smallest ones. This story reminds us that intelligence and insight can emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that age doesn't always correlate with wisdom or capability. Emma's journey from passenger to strategic consultant demonstrates that when we listen to fresh perspectives and remain open to unconventional thinking, we often discover solutions that traditional approaches might miss. Sometimes the most important leaders are the ones who see patterns that others overlook, and sometimes a child's voice can provide exactly the clarity that adults need to solve complex problems. What did you think of Emma's story? Rate it from 1 to 10, and let us know where you're listening from. Thank you for watching and sharing this moment with us.